I think I didn't do anything wrong, just a little harmless flirting at a party. But when my husband came home later, he wasn't shouting. He was quiet, calm, and holding a thick envelope. That was the moment I realized my game wasn't funny anymore. Before we dive deeper into this story, I have one small request. Please subscribe, drop a like, comment, and hit that hype button to boost this channel so more people can discover these incredible stories. The night of the party was supposed to be fun. At least that was what I told myself, as I zipped up my dress and checked my reflection in the mirror one last time. I wanted to look dazzling, radiant, and above all, untouchable. Thomas stood in the bedroom doorway, already dressed in his neatly pressed shirt and jacket, looking every bit the quiet accountant he always was. I teased him that he looked like he was going to a job interview instead of a celebration, and he gave me that small, controlled smile that never gave anything away. Inside, I rolled my eyes. He was always too reserved, too careful, too unwilling to step into the spotlight. I told myself I needed the attention, that I deserved to shine, and that if he couldn't provide that, I had every right to seek it elsewhere, even if only in small, playful ways. The banquet hall was alive with chatter, clinking glasses, and bursts of laughter. Warm lights glowed above long tables, music hummed in the background, and everywhere I looked, people were relaxed, loose, happy to be there. We were seated near the front, close enough to the dance floor that I could feel the energy, but not so close that Thomas would be dragged out to dance, which I knew he dreaded. Beside us sat Daniel Rhodes, his best friend since college, tall and charming with a quick wit that drew people in. I noticed the way other women leaned toward him when he spoke, and I decided that night I would prove I could claim his attention too. It started with small things, touching his arm lightly when he made a joke, laughing a little too loudly, leaning close so my perfume would brush past him. Thomas sat across from us, watching, his face tightening as the evening wore on. At one point, Daniel teased me about always being the one to tell stories, and I leaned back in my chair, smirking, saying maybe that was why Thomas had married me. Or maybe, I added, tilting my head playfully, he married me so someone could keep things exciting for both of us. The laughter at the table was immediate, but I saw Thomas's jaw clench. I ignored it, reveling in the thrill of the spotlight. When Thomas leaned forward and told me quietly that I should tone it down, I rolled my eyes and said loudly enough for the table to hear that he was too sensitive. A ripple of uneasy chuckles passed around us. I added, "Don't be paranoid, it's just harmless fun." Daniel chuckled nervously, lifting his glass, and tried to change the subject, but the moment had already stung. Thomas looked at me, his eyes heavy with something that wasn't anger but disappointment, and I hated the way it made me feel, so I struck again. I said maybe he was just upset because Daniel had a better sense of humor. That drew another awkward laugh from Naomi, who sat nearby, but the tension in the room thickened. As the evening continued, I found ways to needle Thomas under the guise of playfulness. I danced with Daniel once when a group pulled us onto the floor, swaying lightly, letting my laughter carry across the room while Thomas stood at the edge, hands in his pockets. When he tried to approach, I brushed him off with a smile, telling him not to be so jealous. To the others, I made it seem like a joke, but inside, I savored the sting it left in him. I told myself I was proving a point, that he needed to loosen up, that he needed to see I could still capture attention. By the time dessert was served, Emily was glaring at me from down the table, her eyes sharp as knives. She leaned toward me later, muttering that I should stop embarrassing Thomas. I gave her a sweet smile and told her to mind her own business. Margaret, sitting beside her, didn't say anything, but the disappointment in her face was unmistakable. Isabel, who had tagged along for part of the evening before heading home with a babysitter, had overheard whispers at the table and asked innocently why Mommy was dancing with Uncle Daniel more than with Daddy. My chest tightened, but I brushed it off with a laugh, telling her Daddy didn't like dancing, that I was only having fun. She nodded, but her eyes looked troubled, and I quickly redirected her attention before she could ask more questions. When the party wound down, Thomas left early. He didn't make a scene, didn't shout, didn't demand I follow him. He simply excused himself, thanked Daniel politely, and walked out. I stayed behind, sipping wine and laughing with Naomi, pretending his departure meant nothing. Naomi told me I was wicked but brilliant, that men needed reminders they weren't irreplaceable. I laughed with her, pretending to agree, but part of me felt a strange hollowness I couldn't shake. Still, I told myself I had won. By the time I got home, the house was quiet. Thomas was in the study, his papers spread out neatly in front of him. I tried to tease him, saying he had missed the best part of the night, but he didn't answer. He looked up once, his face unreadable, then returned to his work. Irritated, I accused him of sulking. He said nothing. I pushed harder, saying he was boring, that Daniel knew how to have a good time. He closed the folder he was working on, stood up, and walked to the guest room without a word. The silence stung more than anything, but I told myself it meant I had the power. That night, lying in bed alone, I replayed the evening in my head. I remembered the looks from Margaret and Emily, the whispers at the table, the tightness in Thomas's jaw, and Isabel's innocent question. But instead of feeling regret, I clung to my justification. It was just harmless fun, nothing serious, nothing worth all this drama. If Thomas couldn't handle it, that was his flaw, not mine. I convinced myself of that as I drifted off to sleep, but in the back of my mind, unease lingered like a shadow, and in the quiet of the house, I failed to notice the sound of Thomas's pen scratching against paper in the guest room, steady and patient, as if he were already writing the first lines of an answer I wasn't prepared to face. The following morning, I acted as if nothing had happened. I hummed while making coffee, laid out toast for the children, and pretended the house was the same as always. Thomas sat at the table, quiet, reading over a stack of documents. His silence unnerved me, but I masked it with bright chatter, telling the kids funny stories and asking about their plans for the day. When Thomas finally spoke, it was only to remind Isabel to take her homework folder and to tell Aaron to grab his jacket. He didn't look at me once. The chill in the air was undeniable, but instead of admitting fault, I told myself he was sulking and that I would not give him the satisfaction of seeing me uneasy. Later that afternoon, I met up with Naomi at the cafe near her office. She wasted no time in bringing up the party. She laughed, shaking her head, saying I had pushed Thomas too far. I shrugged, insisting it had been harmless. I said I was simply showing that I could still attract attention, that Thomas needed to stop acting like a tired old man. Naomi raised an eyebrow and said, maybe I should consider that I was humiliating him in front of people who mattered. I dismissed her concern with a wave of my hand, saying he was overreacting and that men always did this when they felt their pride was wounded. Deep down, though, her words pressed against something uncomfortable, something I didn't want to acknowledge. When I returned home that evening, Thomas wasn't there. The children said he had left after work without telling them where he was going. I frowned, irritated, but told myself he was probably blowing off steam. I poured myself a glass of wine and settled on the couch, scrolling through my phone when the front door finally opened. Thomas entered, his expression calm but unreadable, carrying a folder tucked under his arm. I asked where he had been, trying to sound casual. He said he had things to take care of. I scoffed, accusing him of being dramatic, and said he was acting like a victim over a joke. He glanced at me briefly, his eyes flat, and walked past me without answering. That night, I followed him into the bedroom, pressing him to talk. I accused him of freezing me out and demanded he admit he was being paranoid. He stood there, steady, and finally said that what happened at the party had not been harmless. He said it was disrespect, intentional and cruel. I rolled my eyes and told him he was imagining things, that Daniel didn't even care, that no one would remember. Thomas said the children remembered. My stomach twisted for a second, but I quickly snapped back, saying he was twisting things. I told him he had no sense of humor, that he was making himself the villain in his own home. He didn't argue, didn't raise his voice. He simply turned off the light, lay down, and closed his eyes. Over the next few days, I noticed a pattern. He was quiet, but not distant in the way I had expected. He was purposeful, deliberate, and oddly composed. He still played with the kids, still asked about their schoolwork, still did the small tasks around the house, but with a strange detachment, as if he were going through the motions of a routine he no longer felt connected to. Naomi called me one afternoon, asking if Thomas had calmed down yet. I laughed and said he was still pouting, still trying to make me feel guilty. She asked if I was sure I wasn't pushing too far. I said men always came back around eventually, and that Thomas was too weak to do anything drastic. But then Margaret visited. She brought groceries and asked if she could stay for tea. She sat at the kitchen table, her face serious, and told me I needed to stop making Thomas into a joke. She said people were talking, that Thomas was hurting, and that I was putting the children in the middle of something they didn't deserve. I scoffed and said Margaret was exaggerating, but the stern look she gave me unsettled me more than I wanted to admit. When she left, Isabel asked me why Aunt Margaret seemed mad. I forced a smile and told her it was nothing, but inside, I felt the ground shift beneath me. That evening, Thomas came home later than usual again, carrying more folders. He placed them neatly in his study, locking the door behind him. I asked what he was hiding. He said calmly that it was work. I accused him of keeping secrets, of trying to make me look like the unstable one. He didn't rise to the bait. He only said he was protecting what mattered. I snapped at him, demanding to know what that meant, but he offered no explanation. His silence made me furious, but also nervous. At dinner, Erin asked why Daddy didn't laugh at Mommy's jokes anymore. The question hung in the air like a stone. I forced a laugh and said Daddy was just tired, but Thomas didn't even look up. Isabel pushed her food around her plate quietly, and Margaret's earlier words came back to me. I told myself Thomas was manipulating the kids against me, that he was playing some kind of long game to paint me as the problem. That night, when I told Naomi about it, she said maybe Thomas was planning something. I laughed, saying he wouldn't dare. But a part of me, small, buried, wondered if she was right. A few days later, I overheard him on the phone in his study. His voice was low, steady, speaking words I couldn't make out, but the tone was professional, almost detached. I pressed my ear closer, catching fragments: custody, records, witnesses. My chest tightened, but I told myself I must have misheard, that I was imagining things. When he came out, I asked who he had been talking to. He said simply that it was someone who could help him understand his options. I laughed too loudly, accusing him of being paranoid, of blowing everything out of proportion. He only looked at me, long and measured, before walking away. That night, lying in bed alone again, I replayed the past week. The party, the silence, the folders, the locked study door, the hushed phone calls. I told myself it was just a phase, that he was trying to scare me, that he would calm down eventually. But deep inside, a sharp unease grew. Thomas wasn't sulking anymore. He was preparing. And I couldn't shake the feeling that when he finally spoke, I wouldn't like what he had to say. The following weekend came with a quiet tension that was impossible to ignore. Normally, Thomas would suggest a family outing, or at least take the kids to the park, but instead he stayed indoors, working in his study with the door closed. I busied myself with cleaning, making sure the house sparkled, trying to project normality, but every time I passed that locked door, a coil of irritation wound tighter in my chest. It wasn't just what he was doing in there, it was the fact he wouldn't tell me. When I knocked and asked if he wanted coffee, he said no without even opening the door. I told myself he was being childish, that he was playing some elaborate silent protest, and that I wasn't going to give him the satisfaction of seeing me sweat. In the afternoon, I called Naomi and complained that Thomas was still sulking. She asked me if I had considered apologizing, just to calm things down. I laughed bitterly and said apologizing would make me look guilty, and I hadn't done anything wrong. Naomi sighed, saying Thomas might not see it that way. I told her men were dramatic, and that Thomas had always been sensitive about his pride. She told me to be careful, that sometimes silence was louder than shouting. Her warning unsettled me, but I brushed it aside, deciding I wouldn't let Thomas dictate how I acted in my own home. That evening, Margaret stopped by again, claiming she was checking in on the children. She brought cookies and asked how things were. Thomas emerged from his study only briefly, kissed Isabel and Aaron on the head, and went back inside. Margaret gave me a look I didn't like, half pity, half disapproval, and asked why Thomas seemed so closed off. I snapped back that he was playing the victim, trying to make everyone think I was a monster, when in reality it had been a harmless bit of fun at a party. Margaret said sharply that humiliation was never harmless, and that maybe I needed to see how much damage I was doing. I rolled my eyes, accusing her of always taking her brother's side. She left soon after, and I told myself she was just meddling, trying to turn Thomas against me even further. But later that night, Isabel came into my room. She asked if Daddy was mad at me. Her big eyes looked worried, and for a moment, I felt something twist inside me. I forced a smile and told her Daddy was just tired, that sometimes adults needed space. She seemed unconvinced, but nodded slowly before shuffling back to bed. As I lay there afterward, I told myself Thomas was manipulating even the children into thinking something was wrong. I felt my anger grow, mixed with a sharp edge of fear I didn't want to name. The next morning, I decided to confront Thomas. I cornered him in the kitchen while the kids were getting ready for school. I demanded to know why he was locking himself away and ignoring me. He looked at me with that calm, unreadable expression and said he was doing what was necessary. I scoffed, saying he was being cryptic to scare me. I accused him of trying to punish me by freezing me out. He didn't argue, didn't raise his voice. He just told me that actions had consequences, and then walked away. That sentence stayed with me all day, gnawing at me like a thorn. I tried to shake it off by meeting Naomi for lunch. I complained about his coldness, about Margaret's meddling, about how even the children were starting to question me. Naomi asked me what exactly I had expected to happen after flirting so openly with Daniel at the party. I bristled, saying it had been a joke, that I hadn't actually done anything. She said perception mattered, especially in a marriage, and that maybe Thomas wasn't as powerless as I thought. I snapped that she sounded just like Margaret. Naomi sighed and told me to wake up before I lost everything. That night, Thomas didn't come straight home from work. Hours passed, and my irritation grew. When he finally walked in, he was carrying another folder, and I caught the glint of an envelope tucked inside. I asked him directly what it was. He said calmly that it was something important. I pressed him, raising my voice, accusing him of hiding things from me, of plotting behind my back. He said he was gathering what he needed to make things clear. My heart pounded at his words, but I forced myself to laugh, mocking him, saying he was bluffing. He didn't respond, just walked upstairs. Later, I snuck into the study while he was in the shower, trying the door. It was still locked. I pressed my ear to it, as if the wood might tell me its secrets. I couldn't stand not knowing. My thoughts spiraled. Was he really talking to lawyers? Was he planning to leave me? To take the children? The more I thought about it, the angrier I became. He was making himself into the hero of some story where I was the villain. I told myself I couldn't let that happen. The next day at work, I found myself distracted, staring at my computer screen while my mind spun. Every unanswered question felt heavier. When Naomi texted me to ask how things were going, I almost typed out that I was scared. Instead, I sent back a casual line about Thomas still sulking, keeping the mask in place. I couldn't let anyone see me rattled. Not yet. That weekend, Thomas surprised me. He told me he was taking the kids to visit his mother. Normally, he would ask if I wanted to come, but this time he didn't. He simply said they would be gone overnight. I forced a smile, saying it was fine, that I needed some rest anyway. Inside, I burned. Was he cutting me out? Was he trying to build alliances with Margaret behind my back? When they left, the house felt unbearably quiet. I poured myself a drink, staring at the locked study door again. For the first time, I felt truly shut out of my own life. When they returned the next evening, the children were subdued, clinging to Thomas more than usual. Isabel barely looked at me, and Erin asked if Daddy was going to be home more now. I laughed too loudly, saying of course Daddy lived here. Why would he ask that? Thomas just gave me that same unreadable look, then turned away. That night I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, replaying every detail of the past few weeks. The party, the silence, the folders, the late nights, the children's questions. I told myself Thomas was trying to manipulate me into begging for forgiveness, but a darker thought crept in. What if he wasn't bluffing at all? What if he had already set things in motion? My confidence faltered for the first time. I didn't want to admit it, but something was happening beyond my control, and as I closed my eyes, I realized with a jolt that the silence I had dismissed as weakness was something far more dangerous. Thomas wasn't sulking. He was planning. The following week unfolded like a performance in which I was no longer the star, but a nervous understudy watching someone else take center stage. Thomas carried himself with a quiet composure that infuriated me. He went about his routine with mechanical precision, getting the children ready for school, preparing their lunches, and even reminding Isabel about her piano practice and Aaron about his spelling words. He barely spoke to me, except for brief, polite comments that made me feel like a guest in my own home. I tried to provoke him one evening by dressing up and saying I was going out with colleagues for drinks, emphasizing that Daniel might be there too. I wanted to see a flash of jealousy, some sign of weakness. Instead, Thomas just nodded and said he hoped I would be safe. His calmness was unbearable. At the party weeks earlier, I had told myself he was pathetic for not standing up to me. Now his silence was worse than any argument. I felt as though he was slowly erasing me, making me irrelevant in the eyes of our children and our friends. I vented to Naomi again, telling her Thomas was trying to make me paranoid by acting so controlled. She asked if I had noticed that I was the only one complaining, while Thomas stayed quiet. She said sometimes quiet men were the most dangerous because they waited until their plan was finished before they acted. I snapped at her, accusing her of exaggerating. But her words clung to me later that night when I lay awake, listening to Thomas's steady breathing beside me, wondering what thoughts circled in his mind. The tension deepened when Margaret invited us to a family dinner. I didn't want to go, but Thomas insisted the children should see their grandmother, so I put on my best smile and came along. The moment we arrived, I could feel the judgment in the air. Margaret greeted Thomas warmly but barely acknowledged me. During dinner, she made pointed comments about loyalty and respect in marriage. Isabel sat stiffly beside her grandmother, while Aaron whispered to Thomas about the chicken being too salty. When I tried to lighten the mood with a joke about men always being dramatic, no one laughed. Instead, Margaret said sharply that jokes sometimes revealed the truth people were too cowardly to say outright. Thomas didn't defend me. He simply poured himself another glass of water and looked at me as if daring me to argue. I excused myself to the bathroom, gripping the sink and glaring at my reflection, furious that Margaret could turn a simple dinner into a courtroom. The next day, I found Thomas sitting at the kitchen table with a notepad, writing something. I asked what it was, trying to sound casual. He covered it with his hand and said he was organizing things for work. But his eyes betrayed nothing, no flicker of guilt or hesitation. I felt as though I was speaking to a stranger. Later, When he left the notepad unattended for a moment, I rushed over to glance at it. The page was filled with lists, dates, names, references to conversations, even expenses. My stomach dropped. It wasn't work, it was evidence. I quickly stepped back when I heard his footsteps, plastering on a smile. He picked up the notepad without a word, sliding it into his folder. That night, I confronted him directly. I told him I knew he was keeping track of things, that he was turning our marriage into a record book. He looked at me calmly and said the truth needed to be clear. I demanded to know what he planned to do with it. He simply said that the children deserved honesty. I mocked him, saying no one would believe his petty little notes. He didn't flinch. He told me quietly that facts spoke louder than excuses, then went upstairs. For the first time, I felt a crack in my certainty. Desperate to regain control, I tried to win the children back to my side. I took Isabel shopping for new shoes and bought Aaron the video game he had been asking for. They smiled and thanked me, but when Thomas entered the room later, they lit up more at his presence than at the gifts. Isabel asked Thomas to help her tune her violin, ignoring me completely. I felt invisible, as though I was losing my grip not only on Thomas but on my own children. I accused him of turning them against me. He responded that children saw more than adults realized. That line haunted me, as though he knew I couldn't hide behind my justifications anymore. The final straw came one evening when Naomi visited the house. She asked Thomas if they could talk privately, leaving me seething in the living room. When she left, I demanded to know what she had said. He replied that she cared about our family, and that was all. I raged at him, accusing him of conspiring with my own friend against me. He stayed calm, saying he didn't need to conspire because the truth revealed itself in time. That composure broke something in me. I screamed that he was pathetic, that even if he gathered 1,000 notes, no one would ever side with him against me. He didn't reply. Instead, he handed me a sealed envelope and said I should open it when I was ready. Then he walked out of the room with the children following close behind, their eyes wide with confusion and fear. I stood there, shaking, the envelope heavy in my hand. My instinct was to tear it up, to burn it without looking inside. But my curiosity gnawed at me. I slipped it open and saw what was inside. Copies of emails, text messages, screenshots of conversations where I had mocked Thomas, bragged to Naomi about manipulating him, even hinted about Daniel being a better man. My face went cold. He had been collecting my own words, my own boasts, twisted back against me. I told myself it meant nothing, that no one would take those seriously. Yet deep down, I knew the tide had turned. For the rest of the night, I sat alone in the living room, staring at the folder on the coffee table, the envelope still open beside it. Thomas had stopped shouting, stopped pleading, stopped asking. He was moving forward quietly, steadily, building something I couldn't see but felt looming like a storm on the horizon. My confidence wavered for the first time, not because of guilt but because I realized I was no longer in control of the narrative. The cliffhanger settled like a weight in my chest. Thomas had proof, patience, and a plan, and I had nothing but fear of what was coming next. The days that followed felt like walking through a maze where every turn led me back to the same locked door. Thomas no longer bothered to hide his quiet preparation. The folders multiplied, the notepad filled with precise notes, and even the children seemed to understand something important was happening. Isabel grew quieter around me, while Aaron clung to Thomas whenever they were in the same room. I tried to tell myself it was temporary, that Thomas was overplaying his hand, that eventually he would realize no one would actually believe him over me. But the more I watched his calm efficiency, the more uneasy I became. One evening, while the children were at Margaret's house, Thomas asked me to sit down at the dining table. He slid a folder across the surface without speaking. My stomach clenched as I opened it. Inside were printed copies of conversations between Naomi and me. Messages where I had mocked Thomas, where I'd bragged about how easy it was to make him look small at parties. where I had hinted that Daniel was more of a man than he would ever be. I tried to laugh it off, saying those were private jokes between friends, meaningless exaggerations. Thomas didn't react. He simply asked if I denied writing them. I snapped back that of course I wrote them, but that words didn't mean anything. He said calmly that words revealed intentions, and intentions mattered in marriage. I tried to throw the folder back at him, but he didn't flinch. He just picked it up and said it was one piece of many. Over the next week, the walls closed in tighter. Thomas scheduled meetings outside the house more often, dressed more formally, and carried himself with a professional detachment that I couldn't penetrate. I demanded to know if he was speaking with lawyers. He said the time for secrets was over and that everything would be revealed soon. I called him paranoid, said he was destroying our family over imagined slights. He replied that the family had already been destroyed by truth, not by imagination. Those words chilled me, though I masked it with mocking laughter. Naomi confronted me after work one day. She said Thomas had asked her to provide copies of our conversations, and she had given them willingly. I accused her of betrayal, of siding with him. She looked at me with pity, saying she couldn't lie for me anymore, not when children were involved. She told me Thomas wasn't weak like I believed, that he was methodical, careful, and determined. I shouted that she was jealous of me, jealous of my life, but even as I said it, my voice trembled. When I returned home that night, Thomas was waiting in the living room with another envelope. He said it was official now. My hand shook as I tore it open. Inside were legal documents, petitions for divorce, custody arrangements, and a financial breakdown of assets. He had highlighted sections showing where he sought primary custody of Isabel and Aaron, citing emotional stability and harmful conduct on my part. Attached were statements from Margaret and even Naomi, testifying to my behavior. I gasped, demanding how he had convinced them. He said he hadn't convinced anyone, that they had simply told the truth when asked. I accused him of manipulation, of poisoning everyone against me. He said quietly that I had done that myself. For the first time, my voice failed me. I tried to argue, but the words caught in my throat. I saw the steady certainty in his eyes, and I realized he wasn't bluffing. This wasn't some dramatic performance to scare me back into line. It was real. I slammed the papers shut and shouted that no judge would ever take my children from me. He replied calmly that judges valued evidence, not theatrics. I stormed out of the room, slamming the door, but the sound felt hollow, powerless. The next morning, Margaret arrived unannounced with the children. She said she would be taking them for the weekend while things were sorted. I protested, shouting that she had no right. Thomas stood behind her, holding another folder, and said it was temporary but necessary for their well-being. The children hugged me stiffly before leaving, glancing back at their father for reassurance. I felt an emptiness in the house when the door closed, as though their absence had carved out a hollow space I couldn't fill. I called Daniel in desperation, asking him to meet me for coffee. When I vented about Thomas's betrayal, Daniel shifted uncomfortably. He said he hadn't meant for the flirtation at the party to cause all this. He admitted he had spoken with Thomas, telling him nothing inappropriate had happened, but confirming my comments and behavior. I felt as though the ground had been ripped out beneath me. Daniel, too, had sided with Thomas. When I returned home, the house was too quiet. Thomas sat at the table again, another document in hand. This one was an official court notice. He had already filed. The hearing was scheduled. I shouted that he was ruining everything, that he was tearing apart our family. He responded that I had done that the night I chose humiliation over respect. His voice was calm, but there was no softness left. It was the voice of a man who had already accepted the end. I tried to rally, telling myself I could still talk my way out of this, convince a judge that Thomas was overreacting, that everyone else had been misled. But in my heart, I knew the evidence was too heavy, the witnesses too strong. I was losing control of the story I had told myself for years. That night, alone in the silent house, I stared at the documents spread across the table. Every page was a reflection of my own words, my own actions, twisted into undeniable proof. For the first time, I couldn't escape the truth. Thomas had been patient, methodical, and mercilessly precise, and I had underestimated him completely. The cliffhanger settled with brutal clarity. The next time we stood in the same room, it would be in front of a judge. The day of the hearing arrived with a heaviness I couldn't shake. The courthouse loomed ahead, cold and impersonal, its stone walls reflecting none of the chaos inside my chest. I walked in, wearing my best dress, hairstyled, makeup flawless. I told myself presentation mattered, that no matter what Thomas had collected, I could still sway the impression. I rehearsed the lines in my head, misunderstood, taken out of context, a woman punished for a joke. But when I saw Thomas sitting calmly at the table with his lawyer, my confidence faltered. He wasn't nervous. He wasn't fidgeting. He sat with quiet dignity, as though he had already won. The lawyer he'd hired was sharp, speaking clearly, presenting the folder of evidence piece by piece, copies of my messages with Naomi, notes Thomas had taken, recording dates, times, and my own words. Even the testimony Daniel had reluctantly given, confirming the flirtation and my cruel remarks. Margaret's statement was read aloud, describing my behavior in front of the children, the humiliation Thomas endured at family gatherings, the way Isabel had asked her why Mommy always made Daddy look small. Every word cut through me. I wanted to stand up, to shout that they were exaggerating, that this was all theatre. But I sat frozen, my hands clenched, my pulse hammering. When it was my turn to speak, I tried to summon the charm that had always carried me through arguments. I told the court that I had never been unfaithful, that everything Thomas had collected was out of context, exaggerated, blown into a narrative that wasn't real. I said I was being punished for a sense of humor, for a personality that others couldn't handle. I tried to laugh lightly, to show I was calm, but my voice cracked at the edges. The judge's eyes narrowed, unimpressed. Thomas didn't even look at me. He kept his gaze forward, focused, unshaken. The lawyer asked about the children. I said I loved them, that I provided for them, that they needed their mother. Then Thomas's lawyer presented written testimony from Isabel's piano teacher, who noted the girl's recent withdrawal, the way she expressed fear of making Mommy mad. I felt my stomach drop. How could he have gathered so many voices, so many pieces of evidence? It was like a net closing around me, every struggle only tangling me deeper. When the session ended for the day, I tried to confront Thomas in the hallway. I hissed at him that he was destroying our family, that he was brainwashing everyone against me. He turned, looked me straight in the eye, and said quietly that I had destroyed it myself the moment I decided humiliation was a game. Then he walked away, the children holding his hands, Margaret trailing behind like a guardian of his newfound strength. I stood rooted in place, seething, my words caught in my throat. The following week brought the final blow. The judge ruled in Thomas's favor for primary custody, citing the overwhelming evidence of emotional harm. I was granted visitation, but limited and structured. Financially, the division favored Thomas as well. The careful documentation of my spending, my late nights, and my dismissive remarks about responsibilities weighed against me. I stared at the papers, numb, as the reality settled. Thomas had not only won, he had done so by outplaying me completely. At home, the house felt like a stranger's place. The children's laughter was gone, their toys neatly packed away for Margaret's house. Thomas no longer avoided me. He didn't need to. He was respectful, distant, untouchable. I tried one last time to corner him, demanding to know if this was what he had wanted all along, to trap me, to humiliate me. He shook his head and said it had never been about revenge. It had been about protecting the children and himself from someone who thought cruelty was entertainment. His words sliced through the last defense I had, I tried to spin the story to friends, saying Thomas had manipulated everyone, that I had been unfairly judged. But even Naomi refused to play along anymore. She said gently that I needed to look at myself, that no one had twisted my words. I had spoken them freely. Her pity stung more than her criticism. I realized then that I was alone, stripped of allies, exposed by the very people I had thought too weak to challenge me. The final moment came quietly, without spectacle. Thomas came to collect the last of the children's belongings. He thanked me for cooperating, though we both knew I had no choice. Isabel hugged him tightly and whispered something in his ear. Aaron clutched his hand, refusing to let go. I stood there, frozen, watching them leave with him. The door closed, and the silence was complete. I told myself I hadn't done anything wrong, that I had just joked, just flirted, just spoken too freely. But as I looked at the empty house, the reality became inescapable. Thomas hadn't needed rage or violence. He had used patience, truth, and the law. And in doing so, he had dismantled everything I thought I controlled. The story ended there, not with a dramatic explosion, but with the quiet, devastating finality of a man who refused to play my game anymore. Don't forget to hit like, subscribe, and turn on the bell so you don't miss the next story. Write in the comments from which city you are watching.